Welcome back, everybody. In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the human brain. We're going to take a cursory look at some of its structures and their most important functions. Of course, we'll go into more depth in future lectures, but for now, let's take a look at our agenda for the rest of the day. First of all, we'll be thinking about how we can conceptually divide the brain into different parts. Then we will be studying the cerebrum in more depth. The cerebrum is the biggest part of the brain and probably what you imagine when you think of a brain. Next, we'll be looking at the main lobes of the cerebral cortex and study their associations and respective functions. Lastly, as always, we'll end with a small revision test to see what you've remembered and recalled. You can think of the brain as being divided into three main parts. The first of those being the cerebrum. This is the largest part of the brain and probably what you think of whenever you envision what a brain is. And this is where all of our conscious thoughts and actions originate. The next is the brainstem down here in yellow, and that's what relays all of the signals of the nerves from the rest of our body to our brains. And lastly, here in purple is the cerebellum. All vertebrates have one. That means fish, birds, and even mammals like us. It comes from the Latin word for little brain, and for a long time, scientists thought that it was only responsible for coordinating motor movements, but now we know that it plays an important role in consolidating memory. So 5 important structures that we'll be looking at more depth today include parts of these 3 other parts we just looked at: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain are all different parts of the brainstem. As we just saw, the cerebellum is its own thing. And the diencephalon, or interbrain, consists of different structures that you will see located within the cerebral hemispheres. So, let's take a further look. Here we can see a bisection of the brain. To bisect something means to cut it evenly into 2 different parts. And you'll often see a model like this in anatomy textbooks because it gives us an excellent view into some of the brain's internal structures. So we're looking here at the right cerebral hemisphere, but it looks pretty much the same as the left, although it will have different functions we'll look at later. So let's start by looking at the thalamus, which is one of the structures in the diencephalon, and it is this almond-shaped part right here. The thalamus is the body's relay center. It's sending all the information from your nerves to your cerebral cortex for higher processing. Next, we have the pineal gland, also here internally, and it's called the pineal gland because it's kind of shaped like a pine cone. It's responsible for the production of the hormone melatonin, and fun fact, the French philosopher René Descartes, before we understood much about anatomy, thought that this was where the seat of the human soul was located. We also see here the cerebellum. You remember what that does, right? The Latin little brain that's responsible for motor movement and memory. So let's move on to discussing the different structures of the brainstem. First and closest to the rest of your nervous system is the medulla oblongata. And it, like all other functions of the brainstem, are responsible for controlling autonomic activity, things that you don't have to think about. And that means that even if you're in a coma or the main structures of your brain are damaged, you can still do things like breathe, have your heart beat, swallow, even track things with your eyes, because these are all controlled by different parts of the brainstem. So first, the medulla oblongata is responsible for mainly breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and the sleep-wake cycle. The pons is the next structure that we'll see here. It is this part that I'm highlighting, and it, among other things, is responsible for balance, chewing, swallowing, bladder control, eye movement, facial expressions, and production of saliva and tears. Again, things that your body all does automatically without you even having to try. And the part of the brainstem closest and most internal to the rest of the other parts of the brain is the midbrain. And that, among other things, is responsible for visual and auditory reflexes, arousal, meaning how alert or focused you are, and temperature regulation. So moving on, let's look at some more structures of the diencephalon, meaning that internal part of the brain. And the pituitary gland is located right here. It's a tiny pea-shaped gland, but it's often called the master gland because it's responsible for regulating all sorts of endocrine functions throughout your body, such as growth, sexual development, sex drive, lactation, lots of things, including metabolism as well. Next, we will have the hypothalamus. That is located here, and it's responsible for connecting all impulses from your endocrine system to other parts of your brain. Now, there's some other structures in the diencephalon, like the epithalamus, that we'll look at in a later lecture, but first of all, let's focus on these. As we just saw, the brain has two hemispheres, the right and the left, connected by the corpus callosum. But did you know that the left half of your brain is responsible for the right half of your body, and the right half is responsible for the left? That means that it's my left hemisphere right now that's controlling the movements that I make to write with my right hand, or if I move my right arm or feel something in my right arm, all the information is being sent and received by my left hemisphere and vice versa. So, in addition to motor movement and sensation from certain halves of the body, there are other functions of the brain which are lateralized. That means that they occur more in one hemisphere than the other. So the right hemisphere is thought of as the more image and visual part of the brain. So in addition to controlling the left half of your body, it's also responsible for selective perception, how you can focus on one thing but still be aware of what's going on around you. It's also responsible for complex movement, fine motor movement, which is how you can visually take in information and be able to interact with the world and manipulate objects within it. Next is facial perception, very important evolutionarily. How can a baby tell that this is their mother and not just some strange woman in less than a second? So again, it deals with images. It's part of your right hemisphere. We also have the sense of smell, olfactory perception, that's going on in your right hemisphere. The visualization of complex images, how a picture can be painted in your mind's eye. And episodic memory. Episodic memory is the narrative of your life, how you can remember your 5th birthday party and see it played right before your eyes. You can remember where you were, what you did next, what you were doing before. And like an episode, it'll all play right out in your head. So the left hemisphere is thought of as the more logical part of your brain. This is what deals with calculations, numbers, facts, and very importantly, speech and language. So in addition to controlling the right half of your body physically, it's also responsible for divided attention. Think about when you're driving, right? You can pay attention to where you're going, but still function the radio at the same time. Also, it's responsible for image categorization, for visualization of simple images, for speech and language, and semantic memory. Semantic memory is how we can recall names and numbers and facts and figures and concepts, which is very closely tied to language and so therefore located in your left hemisphere. Now let's look at the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. First up here in blue is the frontal lobe, and this is where all the things that we can think of as making us human are located. All of our higher order executive functions, which include impulse control and decision making and planning for the future and reflecting on past information, that's all happening here. And a story that you'll definitely hear if you're in any Psychology 101 class is that of a man named Phineas Gage. He used to work on a railroad where he was impaled through the frontal lobe by a spike. He survived, but he became a completely different person. Before the accident, he was a very diligent worker, very respectful, but after his frontal lobe was damaged, he became a heavy drinker, he became rude and disrespectful, was cursing at his boss, late all the time, and that's because all the parts of his brain that were responsible for controlling his impulses and thinking of future consequences were damaged. So Next up here in yellow is the parietal lobe. That is responsible for sensory integration, taking in information and telling us what it means, particularly the sense of touch. For example, how could I tell, with even my eyes closed, that this is two different fingers that are touching my hand as opposed to just one long object? All that information is decoded by the parietal lobe. Next up is the temporal lobe. This is mainly known as the major auditory processing center of our brain. That means where all the sound comes in, but it also plays some role in visual processing and also integrating and encoding memory. And the occipital lobe, back here in pink, is the first pass processing for all visual input and information. And of course, what's that purple thing there? Don't forget about that little brain. It is the cerebellum. So let's take a quick review of everything that we've covered today. Test time, everybody. Hope you're ready. First question, how many parts are there in the human brain? Well, as we were discussing, there are many different ways that you can conceptually divide the brain into different parts, but if we're going off of what we covered at the beginning of our lecture, when we were looking at the brainstem and the cerebellum and the cerebrum, there would be 3 parts. So if you said 3, you are correct. Next question is about the lateralization of functions between the left and the right hemispheres. So which hemisphere is this about? It's responsible for the visualization of simple images, for speech, and the categorization of images. Remember, there's one side that's more responsible for logic and language. That would be the left hemisphere. Easy way to remember it, L for left, L for logic, L for language and semantic memory. Okay, now let's locate the different parts of the cerebral cortex. First, which color is the frontal lobe? If you'll remember, this is the part that's responsible for higher order executive functions. That is the one in blue, towards the front of your head. Next, the parietal lobe, which is responsible for touch and integrating sensory information. That is in yellow. All right. Next, the occipital lobe, which is responsible for processing visual information. That is over here in pink. And the temporal lobe, which is responsible for auditory processing and consolidation of memory. That is in green. And of course, we can't forget about our friend, the little cerebellum, the little brain, also responsible for memory and motor movement. So, how was it? Did you do well? I'm sure you did. You're smart students. Well, that's all for today. As always, you can check your progress and grades through your account in our online portal. There, you'll see the results of our test from last week, and also don't forget about that research paper that's due at the end of next week. I'll be looking forward to seeing those from you. In our next lecture, we'll be looking at the brain in further depth, specifically the diencephalon. That's the part that includes the pineal gland and the hypothalamus and thalamus and all that good stuff. But anyways, take a look at our syllabus, take a look at your readings for this week, and see you next time.